Welcome to the Sleeping Barber Podcast.
This week we have not one, but two heads of programmatic media buying from Google Canada, talking about everything that's programmatic. Inventory, connected TV, how to measure, AI, privacy sandbox. This is a great conversation. I think you're really going to love it, and stick around to the end for the post-pod.
Welcome to the Sleeping Barber Podcast, a place for business leaders to get the best and most credible information on marketing, strategy, and innovation. Your hosts, Marc Binkley and Vasilis Douros, share their experiences as they gather insights from the world's leading experts. Now, on with the show.
Today, Marc and I are really lucky to welcome two guests. We have Ben Wise and Jeremy Freedman to discuss the state of programmatic in Canada. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Now, for those that don't know, Ben and Jeremy, they both work for Google Canada. And they actually share the same title, Head of Programmatic Media. So before we get into opening thoughts, setting the stage, I really think we need to create a differentiation between the two of you because you look different. So I don't think one of you is a doppelganger of the other. So
you could just think of us as the same person if it's easier.
Yeah. Jer is basically Ben with glasses. I mean, we actually do kind of look the same.
Ben with glasses.
But no, I mean, that's a good question. And I think the reality is we basically operate two teams that are roughly the same. It's just that Google has invested a lot in the programmatic market in Canada. And so we have enough headcount that warrants two full teams of account managers and account executives to make sure that we're servicing everybody in the market.
Jeremy, do you agree with that?
Yeah, more or less. I think one of the most interesting things is that Ben and I both started in the programmatic space at Google when the whole team was four people.
Oh, wow.
So it's pretty cool to kind of be at this point now, roughly 10 years later and kind of seeing the investment that Google Canada has made in programmatic and just how much it's grown over time. I think that we're both really kind of honored and humbled to be in our position, having been here kind of at the beginning as well.
Yeah.
Well said.
Well said. Well said. Well, I think now with that out of the way, it's time to dim the lights and start setting the stage. Marc's just busting the gut over there. It's awesome. But honestly, I think programmatic, it's such a critical component if you think about like the marketers today, what they have access to now more than ever. So it's really changing the game both for advertisers, for media planners and media buyers, but also the consumer, because now that you can get more of those, dare I say, personalized ads that everyone really wants at the end of the day. But it is a very challenging landscape. It's regulatory, is constantly evolving. The frameworks around data privacy is constantly changing around the world and even in Canada here. So this ongoing global dialogue and even considering like the future of cookies and consumer privacy, this makes it a very volatile environment. But I think before we really get into some of those nuances, I think we'd love to level set a little bit. And Ben, we'll probably kick off with you here. If you don't mind sharing like how you would define programmatic media, what is it? What makes it better than just buying through Google directly or using, Facebook ad platforms or anything else like that that's native?
Yeah, I mean, good question. And you're right. The programmatic market in Canada and beyond is very complex and very nuanced. But I mean, at its most basic, programmatic really just means using technology to automate the process of buying your media. A lot of that kind of simplicity can get lost behind jargon and the endless acronyms that we use. But, at the end of the day, that is the straightforward. It's using technology to automate buying media. Now, kind of the second part of your question on kind of the differences of programmatic versus, a Google direct buy or a Facebook or a Meta buy, when you're buying through Meta, all you can access is Meta properties, Facebook and Instagram. When you're buying on Google, you're buying search and YouTube. And don't get me wrong, I love search and YouTube. But programmatic is essentially the rest of the open internet. So think about all of the places online and beyond now where you see ads. So, it's your traditional news sites like the Globe and Mail. It's online video providers from pretty much everywhere, including YouTube, in our case, all the apps you use and all the games you play on your phone. And more recently, it's much beyond those usual screens, and it's on the big screen of your connected television. It's on audio. It's in your earphones when you're walking down the street or, when you're listening to music in the car. We're even seeing out-of-home billboards are being bought programmatically because bringing that technology to those use cases just simplifies and improves the buying process and the buying outcomes.
It's cool. There's like the phrase that, make it easier for buyers to buy is kind of popping in my head. And so from a targeting perspective, maybe Jared, if you could talk about this. Sorry, Jeremy.
You call me Jared. It's okay.
From a targeting perspective, maybe if you could talk about like the targeting capabilities with programmatic, where the targeting data comes from, as V mentioned in the preamble. There's a lot more changes happening on that side of things. So I'm just curious about that. And then how's you mentioned you've been there for 10 years. How's that evolved over time? And just kind of understanding more about that targeting capacity.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, the truth is the targeting possibilities with programmatic are fairly endless. I think to simplify things away from that infinite array of possibilities, I've always kind of thought of things under four main buckets. Prospecting, which is really around applying some basic targeting, like maybe geo-targeting, maybe age or gender, something like that. And then allowing a DSP like DV360, of course, to optimize using its own algorithm. So casting a really wide net, helping the system understand what your goal is at the end of the day, and then leveraging the system's algorithms to kind of narrow things down and find that performance for you. The next bucket, I think at the beginning of programmatic, again, kind of 10 years ago, this is a big shift. I think of it like a pendulum. At the beginning of all of this stuff, everybody thought about programmatic in terms of purely based on audience buying. Mm-hmm. But contextual has always been a possibility as well. And I think given the evolving ecosystem right now, it's becoming more and more important again. And contextual targeting is all about targeting based on the content of a web page. For example, maybe a basketball shoe brand only wants to serve to users who are currently browsing websites about basketball or about shoes. And so I think that 10 years ago, when I kind of started in this space, contextual was really an afterthought when people thought about programmatic targeting. But today that's becoming something that is driving actually a lot of performance, and folks are kind of doubling down on again. Next bucket, audience targeting, and that's all about looking for a specific user regardless of the content that they're in front of. So it's kind of the inverse of contextual targeting. Maybe that basketball shoe company doesn't care, Mark, if you're on a website about soap operas, as long as you're into basketball and athletic apparel. So it's all about kind of the user, and there's kind of different flavors to that as well.
He does frequent those websites
all the time.
I would think so. I mean, who doesn't?
Who
doesn't? Soap opera websites?
Wicked, love it.
Sign me up.
And then I think another one of the main buckets, the fourth one, is kind of private marketplaces. And that's about saying, okay, well, there's a specific piece of content that I want my brand aligned with. So I'm going to strike a deal with maybe that publisher and say, okay, I want to be on your website, but instead of kind of that old school way of signing an insertion order, sending over creative, you're using programmatic pipes to transact against that. So those are kind of the four buckets. And one of the other ways that things have evolved is at the beginning, all of that was just for display. And today, right, as Ben said, we're starting to see connected TV become more and more important. Mobile format, obviously, over the last decade has become one of the predominant ways people access the internet. So I think that those are kind of the main changes, and also still remain kind of the main buckets of targeting that are possible with programmatic. So
in a way, you've got more and more inventory coming on stream because everything is becoming digitized. You mentioned, Ben, the programmatic billboards even. So as all of that becomes accessible, then you guys are able to plug in with pipes to different display devices of various kinds.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the technology basically allows you to access inventory wherever somebody's looking at it. And the really cool thing is a lot of the expertise that, an agency trader might bring to the table and the teams that execute programmatically is in their experience in leveraging these various tools like ours. They're kind of able to say, okay, well, we think this is the best way of targeting those users, whether that's based on context or audience or just leveraging the system's algorithms. So lots of choice. And I think that there's always been a real test and learn culture within the programmatic space.
Yeah, that's, it's funny because it's almost like you also kind of touched there a little bit on the state of programmatic and the evolution that it has been. You touched on contextual, and I think it's interesting because as digital marketers, we probably would have remembered the early stages of digital marketing was all contextual, really.
Totally.
And to see it almost kind of come full circle. And Jeremy, if you don't mind, do you mind just kind of giving us an overview? What is that current state of programmatic here in Canada right now? What are you seeing, and how has it evolved over the last few years?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in Canada at this point, programmatic really is the most prevalent way of buying display and video media online.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a journey that we've been on for the past decade. At the beginning of programmatic, I think there was a lot of fear, a lot of confusion about what that would mean for the digital ecosystem.
Right.
You know, when programmatic first started as a word, I was working for an ad network, and I kind of had a front row seat to all of this change.
Right.
So we've been on this journey for a decade, really. And as part of that evolution, we've seen a lot of traditional media buying skill sets start to get augmented by in-platform execution and optimization knowledge. 10 years ago, it was about what could you do with a spreadsheet, and now it's kind of about what can you do with software.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, in that context, right now is kind of a more exciting time than ever, really. More and more companies are investing in our market. We've certainly seen more competition this year than we've ever had before, and competition breeds innovation. I think everybody really has to be on the top of their game from a tech provider standpoint right now. And then also AI starting to usher in kind of this next phase of programmatic buying in a really big way. I think that nobody was really ready for, you know, just how large of an impact things like ChatGPT and Google's Bard have made over the last year, and how that's kind of been absorbed by not just our industry, but by the mainstream as well.
Yeah, it's been quite incredible.
In terms of inventory, Ben, maybe you can chime in on this one. Like, we had a guy, Pierre, who worked at Cumulus Radio on a while back, talking about the new innovations in ad placement for radio. And so we were talking about out of home and a few other things. In Canada, I wonder if you could talk about Canadian inventory specifically, because, you know, the world is a very big place and there's all kinds of rules and stuff. But as far as it goes in Canada, maybe you could talk about inventory that's available here, and then how it compares to other markets. Like, are we trailing? Are we ahead? Are we behind? Like, how do you think about inventory?
Yeah, so I mean, at a kind of, I think the top line is that programmatic inventory is essentially limitless. I remember I used to put reports on like total impressions that we would see, and you know, this was 5 or 6 years ago, and we're talking, you know, tens of billions of impressions per month. That it's hard to fathom the scale of how many ads there are. And I remember seeing a recent study from eMarketer that looked at time spent with digital media, and you know, the 10-year trend line is up and to the right. And the more time people spend with media, the more opportunities there will be for ad placements. That said, it does not look the same as every other market, and there are a few kind of key nuances to understand. So the first one, we've talked a lot, you know, CTV being a big theme. The reality is in Canada, we do have, I would say, fewer ad-supported services than the US in particular. Think of like Peacock, Hulu is a really big one. So I think we probably have a little bit less inventory there, which, you know, I guess the flip side is that really benefits Canadian media companies and creates a healthy ecosystem for many of those broadcasters who are shifting a lot of their inventory to programmatic digital options. We do still recommend getting, you know, those buys guaranteed and booked early to make sure that you get it. So that's kind of one area. I think, to your point, though, separately, like the number of types of placements and channels is also ever increasing. And, you know, 5 years ago, we used to talk about there's traditional media and there's digital media. I think that line is really blurring. You know,
Totally.
you know, out of home billboards on the side of the highway, as an example. We've been working with one partner on like audio ads in retail stores. So imagine how you're walking around the Walmart and they have the radio on, but they play specific ads, and we can buy those programmatically, which I think is a really neat one. Even, you know, traditional placements, you think of, you know, your big splashy homepage takeover on the Globe and Mail, that used to be only direct deals. And now, you know, even ones like that are becoming much more open to programmatic. So I think we're seeing a lot of great innovation, both on the buy side and the sell side, and how we all come together to bring that to market to advertisers. I mean, at the end of the day, though, the options are ever increasing, and the amount of inventory is, you know, as I said, essentially limitless. It's a matter of finding the right inventory and the right channels and formats for the advertiser and the brand and the strategy that and I think that's where, you know, that's where the skill lies.
Yeah, I like that you touched on CTV there, or connected TV, because I think it's an important distinction as it continues to evolve. And Ben, I want to kind of stay with you a little bit, and I want to unpack that a little bit more. So you talked a little bit about when compared, say, to the US, when we have some, limited inventory, lower inventory than we would because we don't have Hulu, and I don't remember some of the others.
Roku is a new one. I know.
Roku
recently
exists
put
here, but
inventory.
their scale I don't think is quite as big in the US. And there are more options in the US for sure.
So how do you see that evolving though over time? Do you believe like that space is going to grow even quicker than it has so far?
Yeah, I think definitely CTV will continue to be a big growth driver for, ads in general, but especially digital and programmatic. I've heard people say 2023 is, it's the year of year of CTV. But, me and Jared like to think back to, 10 years ago when we started, and that was the year of mobile. And then I think that was 2011. And then 2012, also the year of mobile. And then 2013, you can see where it made building your decks very easy because you could use last year's slides and just update the date. So we are in.
I remember those decks. Be careful.
Yeah. I presented a few to you. Don't tell my secret. But that's I think where we are in CTV. 2023 is the year of CTV. So will 2024 and 2025, and maybe a few years beyond that. Really, if you want to understand, I think where the industry is going, it's all about following users and their behavior. And they absolutely see ads on the big screen in their living room as television, whether you call it connected TV, whether it's linear TV. We've done some studies, and Canadians, I think it was 61% of Canadians say that YouTube is TV, for people only listening to the audio version, TV in air quotes, when it's viewed on the television screen. To users, they are one in the same. But if you look again at user behavior, they're probably 2 or 3 years ahead of the industry. We are just trying to play catch up. If you look at time spent on devices versus media dollars, we're trailing and we're catching up. And that's probably the same thing that happened in mobile 10 years ago and will happen in audio a year or two from now. We're starting to see that there. So while, YouTube is absolutely one of the biggest sources of ad-supported CTV inventory Canada, there are many others, lots of great partners that we work with. The traditional broadcasters, a lot of newer digital companies, too many for me to start listing them all. I don't want to leave anybody out, but we are lucky that we have a lot of great partners. And I think from a buying perspective, the ability to bring those together into one platform and get that single view of the user and better frequency capping just lets you buy that inventory in a much more effective and efficient way. And it's a net positive for the industry when media performs better. And that's what we're seeing. So definitely excited to see that continued growth and to see the programmatic side of that, YouTube and far beyond that, continue to be a driving force in this market. And I hope to be able to register for Hulu in Canada one day.
I just wanted to, and I like that you highlighted the distinction that YouTube is also connected TV essentially, right? And I think a lot of media buyers or even digital marketers don't see it that way, because if you see it in a media plan, it's always going to be YouTube, this is what you're doing. But the reality is it probably lives under connected TV along with any other buys that you're doing. So I think it's a great distinction.
Yeah, I think it's again, thinking about that user behavior. If I'm watching an hour of YouTube, but it's on my big screen in the living room, like that's what I'm choosing to watch in a TV sitting on the couch environment. And if I choose to watch that, if I choose to watch linear TV, if I choose to, watch Netflix, those are all to me television, regardless of how I access it. It's on the big screen, and we should be listening to and following our users on that.
We got, I'm sure Rogers has something like this out east, but and now it's the same. But Shaw's Blue Stream or whatever it's called, like you just talk into it and then it just pulls up whatever source. And so I don't even know what channel I'm on sometimes. Like it pulls up YouTube stuff for something I'm watching, but I didn't even know that. Like I didn't select YouTube, and so you see the feed, you see the ads, and so like. To me, I'm watching on my TV. My kids are watching on TV. They don't really.
I've got 3 little kids, so I am avoiding the voice-activated TV for as long as I can. But whether they're watching YouTube or whether they're watching, the live NHL game, they say, just put hockey on TV. That's, it's TV. It's all TV to them.
Yeah. In terms of, Jeremy, you mentioned AI briefly a little bit, and so I want to talk and connecting it to what you were just saying, Ben, the idea around connected TV and just the different platforms that are out there and making buying easier. I mean, if you went through all the different channels and had to purchase by channel and publish by, each individual creative for the context that you're putting, it'd be like overwhelmed. Like V and I live that, and it's overwhelmed. So maybe if you can just talk about like AI and machine learning and how you guys see that trend shaping the way that buyers buy or the way you serve ads. And I'm looking for a prescribed answer here, but just the opportunities that exist out there, targeting wise, whatever those things are.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really cool about this is that AI and machine learning have both kind of been baked into the promise of programmatic from the very beginning of programmatic. So anytime we talk about like an optimization algorithm, like that's machine learning, that's AI thinking. I used to do a lot of education on this. And the way that I would explain it is basically the computer's brain. You're telling the computer, hey, software, I want a conversion every time I spend $5. Mm-hmm. And at that point, the computer's job is to figure out, okay, well, to do that, I need to be on these types of sites or target these types of users. So I feel like what we're kind of seeing right now is an acceleration of that type of capability coming from a couple different places. On the cookieless side, which we kind of mentioned at the very beginning, there's an increased need for modeling with things like measurement and things like targeting. Whereas something before we didn't need to do that, and now we do. Mm-hmm. That's another example of AI. Auto bidding, custom bidding is all about feeding the system more information so that it can make even more intelligent predictions about what type of users and what websites it needs to be on to drive those kinds of business outcomes, right? So I think, again, what's really neat is that it's kind of always been there. And I think that this moment, whether it's because of regulations, whether it's because of cookie changes, whether it's because of like this explosion of generative AI, we're starting to see even more examples of all of this being baked into what we do. And that's a really cool thing.
And I'm glad you mentioned that it's always been there. Like, we're talking about it in part because ChatGPT just exploded this year and everybody's like jumping on the bandwagon. But like legitimately, like if you've run a Google ad anytime in the last 10 years or longer even, like it's always been there. And it just seems to be now that we're talking about it more so because of, other external factors, people are kind of catching up. The public kind of is aware of it more in the general zeitgeist.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing because, to Ben's example of the year of mobile from before, I think there's decks from our earliest time at Google where the word AI was definitely in there. And it might mean something different a little bit today than it did before. Right. And GPT has recontextualize a little bit of this stuff, and generative AI is obviously a different thing, but machine learning and elements of artificial intelligence, they've always been so core to what we do. So I feel like we're still kind of on the forefront as the programmatic space embracing these types of concepts. And I'm really interested to see kind of, what that next phase is and where we go from here.
Actually, you just sprung a quick thought here. When it's thinking about like AI, if you were to ask me what AI was 10 years ago, the context would have been a lot different than if I'm answering that question today.
Yeah.
And obviously the accelerator was ChatGPT that just made generative AI essentially accessible to everyone. So overnight, almost like it recalibrated what everyone thinks about AI now. So anyways,
yeah. I never would have thought about it before as how I write copy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. Exactly. And it's such an interesting thing. Like I have a daughter, she's almost 6 years old, and I was explaining to her some of these concepts. And for her, like she's already seen robots and AI and all of like the cartoons that she watches.
Yeah, totally.
It's just kind of the next step into stuff that was totally speculative becoming very tangible reality. And we're watching it in real time. Such a cool front row seat to that whole thing.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. We're going to shift gears a little bit right now. We're going to go into one of my favorite topics, if I'm being honest, and it's the whole notion of in-housing programmatic, the tech stack. And I've been fortunate because I have led initiatives where I have internalized in previous organizations that I worked in. But I'd love to kind of get your take, Ben, on this. And, what do you see as a trend? I'm sensing that there's still a lot more organizations that are looking to in-house a lot of this technology. But also, where do you believe what are the benefits to the internalization, or a company looking at this as a way forward for their programmatic buys?
Yep. And I can remember a few years ago working with you, V, on some of that internalization project for that former brand that you worked for.
Exactly.
Yeah. So a question I hear often from clients and marketers, and I think it's been an interesting point of discussion in programmatic for a decade. There's no right or wrong answer. Some have tried one, some have tried the other, some have tried both and go back and forth. I do think it's kind of important to break it out into two separate components. There's in-housing your contracts and the ownership of the technology and the data. And then there's the in-housing of the actual, hands-on keyboard execution. And those aren't necessarily the same thing. In terms of contracts, I think we've seen more movement on that for sure over the last 5 years. Gives the brand or the owner more transparency, gives them more flexibility. They can shift the partners they work with and maintain that ownership and maintain that continuity. In-housing the execution, not surprising, is a lot harder. We do see that kind of ebb and flow over time. And there were, many examples that I could start listing where they've in-housed it and it's done really, really well. And they continue to have that in-house team who are delivering great performance. There's probably a number of examples where they've in-housed it and then a few key people have left and they've gone back to an agency because, part of the challenge, I think, is just the talent pool for programmatic expertise in Canada is not huge. So it really comes down to, I think a lot of the times, are you staffing up with the right level of resourcing and expertise and talent to make it work? And in cases where that's happened, we've seen it be very successful. In cases where they've tried and they haven't necessarily done those things, we've seen it be less successful. The reality is that in-housing can be great, but it can also be very tough. And, in Canada, at least, I think the programmatic market has primarily been driven by agencies. Agencies and their trading desks exist for a reason. They are, a center of excellence when it comes to all of that programmatic talent and expertise. And honestly, I don't see that kind of agency and trading desks as a driving force. I don't see that changing in the near future.
Is there?
Yeah, you said.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, in terms of a threshold, is there some kind of point in a company's life cycle, or maybe it's a media spend, or the size of the buy, or the size of the geographical zone, or something like that is a real prompt or trigger for people to start looking into doing this on their own?
So short answer is yes. It tends to be the bigger brands where having a team of 5 or 10 people in-house is not cost prohibitive, and they have enough media dollars going through the system where it makes sense to do that. There's no set number once you're, spending X million dollars. There's no magic number like that. I think it depends a lot on the returns you're expecting, the type of talent you can attract, maybe your geographic location, because the talent pools are going to be different across the country. There's as many options, as much diversity as there are brands out there. There is
no doubt.
There's no one right answer. As I said, kind of off the top here, it's making
maintaining it, to your point, with the talent pool. If people leave the organization and that was your one rock star programmatic media buyer, then that's problematic.
You have to start thinking about
that's exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and that's exactly where I was going to go with this, is making sure and looking at it from a resourcing perspective is probably going to be your Achilles heel, or is what's going to actually vault you into that, I don't know what, top 10% where you can actually do it really, really well in-house. And that's just from my own personal experience, is the moment an organization maybe stops investing in that, that's when you have to start looking back to either hybrid models. And I do see a lot of hey, the contracts, let's start phase 1, own the contracts. And you almost see it as a crawl, walk, run approach as well. But yeah, resourcing is probably the most difficult. And that's why agencies still have that, I don't want to say the power, but they can scale a lot quicker than you just trying to do it internally.
Absolutely. And so many businesses in Canada just end up being very seasonal ones. So you think of, if you're a very large retailer, you absolutely have the volume to justify having that big team in Q4.
Yep.
Do you have the same volume in Q1?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not. Whereas when you're an agency and you have
Maybe
a
not.
portfolio of clients, you can kind of give and take across clients and manage some of those bumps and kind of smooth those out naturally. And I think that's part of the agency model, and it's a big advantage for them. But you're right, that
100%.
talent piece is so crucial. I can think of, a number of clients that we work with where they've been really successful in housing and continue to be successful. But, if those key one or two people were to go at the same time, they would suddenly be much less successful. It's not easy.
Yeah, agencies also have built infrastructure for training and handling turnover. And I think one of the things that we've seen with this specifically is, we've touched on it a few times here, but when that turnover happens, it's really difficult to fill that role without losing a step. And agencies are used to that and they're efficient at it.
Yeah. Great
So
points.
interesting enough, I just made this connection. Despite the idea of like AI taking over everyone's jobs, we're talking about the importance of people in this whole process.
Yeah.
If you think of,
Yeah.
Jer was saying how AI has been part of programmatic since day one. And if you look at the headcount that work on programmatic, it has continued to grow despite more and more AI being built into the platform. It makes it more effective, but it doesn't do the job for you. It does elements of the job, but it makes the market bigger, and that will require more bandwidth and more resources to make it work.
I've actually got like a really personal story, which I wasn't planning on sharing, but that crystallizes this. Literally in 2012, I was an intern at Olive Media, and a colleague of mine who was also an intern built a presentation called Replacing People with Robots. And it was about programmatic, but it was specifically about how we were using API tools in the DSP that we were using to make our jobs more efficient. And I remember how much concern there was that we were being literal. And at the time, our point was really these systems and these things that we're doing with these systems are going to free up our time to be more efficient about how we do everything else, right? And there was no ability whatsoever to actually just say, okay, now it's the computer's job to do this. And I don't think that there will be. And it's been always a common misconception of programmatic that the automatic piece is the most important part, but the people have always been the most important part. And we've seen that time and time again.
That's a cool story. 2012.
2012.
They still haven't taken over.
The end is near.
Yeah. In terms of measurement and attribution, Jared, maybe we can just touch on that too, because I'm fascinated in the idea of measurement, especially from like a bigger perspective of marketing, playing a role and contributing value to an organization, not just them, buying media and efficiencies with CPMs and CPCs or ROAS or ROI, but like there's a lot of challenges, especially with cookies and whatever is happening with cookies, whatever's going to replace cookies, and people's desire to turn off tracking and that kind of thing. Where does how does Google and how do you think about tracking those keeping on top of those changes? But then also, how are you thinking about accurately providing value in terms of measurement and attribution, not just for the marketer that you're talking to daily, but also potentially the business who the marketer is reporting up to?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question. I think that from the very beginning of programmatic, part of the value proposition was, or not even programmatic, digital, part of the value proposition was that it was infinitely measurable. And the idea of we can tell you if a user converted, if a user bought something, signed up for something, whatever it is, exactly what ads they clicked on, exactly what ads they saw right across that whole journey. And even in that kind of ideal utopia where all of that was possible, I think it was still a really, really big challenge for brands and agencies to look at things holistically and really come together with a model and an approach that kind of checked all those boxes. And what's happened in the last couple of years with different regulations, but even more so with some of the tech changes around cookies that have been driven by, Apple's ITP, things like that. I think that holes have been poked in that story around it's infinitely measurable. You can see every single touch point. To the point that today, I actually don't believe that it's possible to have a full understanding deterministically of everything that a user did on the internet with ads prior to conversion. And I don't think it's coming back.
So are you saying last click doesn't tell you everything?
Whoa, now. Whoa.
It would be blasphemy for me to say that. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's such an interesting thing because so many brands and agencies, I think, were very used to using last click. And I used to, again, in a previous role in education, I would ask people, Like, why do they think that is? And almost always their answer was because it's the default.
Yeah.
And it's the thing that the system just kind of spits out without doing anything else to it. So it was always a challenge. But anyways, in today's world, it's even more challenging because even if you had all the time in the world, you still couldn't tell a full story. So I think that there's a couple things that brands and agencies need to do kind of in this moment to make sure that they have an accurate picture of measurement attribution. One, I think that, if this is a marketer who's working with an agency, they need to have like a real conversation and make sure that they're on the exact same page about how success to the business is going to be quantified. And they need to have a measurement attribution approach that's consistent. And we've seen a ton of examples over the years of broken telephone between those kind of groups. Yeah. And Google doesn't, have the right to kind of jump in here and say, this is how everybody should do it. That's not really our role in the ecosystem, especially on mine and Ben's side. We provide different tools, and it's up to our partners to decide how they leverage those tools. So I think that a client and an agency aligning on a measurement framework that makes sense for them is number one. Number two, an understanding of kind of where those holes are that didn't exist 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. What are the things that were being tracked that can no longer be tracked deterministically? And they need to have a POV on how they feel about modeling within systems, because there's not a single attribution report right now, or maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there aren't many attribution reports right now that don't leverage modeling to some capacity. And I think a lot of folks just take those numbers still at face value, but then have existential philosophical questions that they haven't answered about their belief or lack of belief within that. So like many challenges in our industry, I think a lot of this comes down to communication, understanding what can't be done and understanding, okay, this is how we're going to navigate that to the best of our ability, everybody being on the same page. And then partners like Google can certainly help be a part of those conversations to advise and to make sure that, we're giving a POV when asked for it. But I think that the two parties that are the most important in kind of solving measurement and attribution in today's world are the agency and the clients that they work with.
And like, just to tie into what you were saying too, Ben, before, like you're getting access to more and more of this inventory, like out of home, connected TV and all the different channels that are out there, whatever they might be. But would it be fair to say that, or assume that when the inventory is available is one point in time, but when it's available to be incorporated into some type of attribution model, it might be a different point in time? Like, so you're like, as your consumer behavior is ahead of the platform technology, is it also true that the availability of inventory is ahead of the measurement capacity?
I would say kind of yes and no to that. And I think to Jared's point, we're never going to be in a world where it's 100% deterministic. And I think you could argue we never were.
Never.
We would say within digital maybe, but there's still everything outside the computer that people were exposed to. I think the reality now, I think it's around understanding all of those factors and the different ways of measuring. There's no measurement framework that's going to be 100% accurate. And so that's one, you need to accept that like, this is as good as we can get, and it's good enough to make business decisions off of. And striving for perfection is a kind of a fool's errand. But two, I think smart marketers are going to look at having multiple different measurement frameworks. Some they're going to use for long-term planning. Some they're going to use for day-to-day optimization. Some they're going to use for kind of midterm budget allocation decisions. But there is going to be no one model to rule them all. It's about how you use multiple tools and kind of triangulate and use each of them for their strengths and understand their weaknesses.
Yeah, and sorry, but I was just when I jumped in to say that thing, Ben, and I cut you off, but I used to work in traditional, and so I remember I was selling radio and TV versus print, and people go, I can tell when somebody sees my ad because they cut it out of the paper and they bring it in. And then, but you would talk to the print ad people and they would go, okay, well, our distribution, like in other words, the number of papers that we print times our readership is our reach. And I'm like, how does that make any sense? I walk by all these boxes on the way to the bus stop and they're all full of papers, or there's, stacks of papers at the foot of like an apartment building. Nobody's picked up any of those or read any. And so there's like this false belief in media from the very beginning about how many people were exposed to the message.
Yeah, I like that term.
So
false
yeah, like
belief.
it's been always a problem.
I often say like
that a
false
lot.
precision, where we have an exact number,
Right.
and because the number has so many decimal points, we think it's super accurate. But I mean, it's very precise, but it's not necessarily an accurate depiction of reality, right? 5 decimal points doesn't make
I
for
think
the truth.
to underscore things, like I think that there's no perfect answer anymore, and I think the best answer is just having a perspective.
Yeah.
As long as that is a conversation that, again, brands and agencies are having, I don't think that there's a wrong answer or a right answer.
Yeah, and I just wanted to highlight I know everyone, I think we can all agree, like last click attribution is like the last thing that you want to look for. If you don't have any model, then yes, use it. But there's instances where you look like Black Friday, Cyber Monday. Those are very finite in the moment, where you could probably lean on that a lot more than doing like your more holistic strategies, or when you're looking at over time. So I'm with you both on this. Is like there isn't probably one right answer, but it's the alignment, the communication, either between client, agency, et cetera, is probably the most important. And even more so on the marketer's job on the client side to try to tell and sell that story internally, and the value of a lot of this effort is bringing in.
For sure.
There's no way we couldn't have a conversation around cookies. And I forgot my glass of milk, but I really wanted to take a moment here and just kind of highlight or kind of put this question towards you there, Jeremy. So, we've heard about, Google's private sandbox proposals. I'd love to understand, how are those going to factor into the future of programmatic in Canada? That's kind of like the first part. And the second part of the question is, how does Google plan to balance the personalization, and privacy concerns that a lot of consumers are having?
Yeah, both great questions again, and I am traumatized by the word cookies. So
I love cookies.
I'm triggered right now, but that's okay.
Not having a 6-year-old
privacy
moment,
sandbox. Yeah, she's a lot of cookies. It's actually both elements for me, the work stuff and the just giving her too many cookies. Privacy sandbox. I mean, the goal of the whole initiative is to create technologies that balance exactly that, people's privacy online, but also give companies and developers tools to build thriving digital businesses, and measurement and targeting is a part of that. So Privacy Sandbox kind of reduces cross-site and cross-app tracking, and its goal is to keep online content and services free for all, because obviously ads are what kind of drives the free and open internet, and a large component of ads is targeting and measurement. So within that, Google Ads and DV360, our programmatic platform, have been experimenting with interest-based audience solutions, which is one of the methodologies kind of being discussed in Privacy Sandbox, and adds kind of a cohort layer on top of something that it was a little bit more of an individualistic targeting tactic in the past.
Right.
In the first quarter of this year, we saw some pretty cool results coming out of a Google Ads test, where they did an experiment around how these interest-based ads, this new methodology, performs when it's relying on a whole combination of different privacy preserving signals, like the Topics API, which is one of the Privacy Sandbox initiatives, and other first-party identifiers like publisher-provided IDs. Super encouraging early results.
Right.
So it's kind of been cool. And like, I think that really the way that Google thinks about Privacy Sandbox from a programmatic platforms perspective is the solutions that come out of that initiative will be some of the underpinning technologies that allow us to target and measure in different ways in the future.
Well, I think at the end of the day, as advertisers, we want to make sure that, we're getting as close as possible to, sharing or creating that personalized content. And, I think the biggest fear was, with the removal of the cookies, that kind of got us as close as possible. It's like, are we now going back to different ways of targeting, where in fact, there's probably more technology that's coming that's going to get us even closer to that personalization journey, which is exciting, especially from an advertising perspective.
Yeah, I think the reality is, like, the last couple of years, we've seen a real fundamental shift in how people feel about their privacy online. Like, I think about this in my personal life. My grandmother's known I've worked at Google for 10 years. She's never asked me a question about her online privacy. And in the last year or so, she's asked me a number of times how companies follow her on the internet. And I genuinely believe that she thinks that there's somebody lurking around corners trying to like look over her shoulder at her cell phone. But it's just so illustrative to me that, you know, the mainstream, not that my grandmother is the best example of mainstream, but the mainstream is starting to think about this, where before all of this was just, you know, in the online ad space. Our ecosystem needs to evolve, and there's no kind of way around that.
I think I love the consumer presence of mind that they have around that now more than ever, especially if you think back 10 years ago. I think and it's pushing technology vendors, even advertisers, to make sure that we are doing our due diligence and we're not using the technology in a malicious way, which is
it's a good thing.
And another example of the technology and the providers catching up to consumers yet again.
Yeah, totally.
Great point.
Yeah, totally. And speaking of which, Ben, maybe if you could just talk about this, and I know we're coming up close to a hard stop for you, Ben, but if you could just touch on the importance of experimentation and you know, could be with the solutions you guys provide from a cookie perspective or from the solution or the perspective of a advertiser or their agency. I'm just curious to know like some examples that you might have about how people have used experimentation to understand better, create a breakthrough, deliver better performance, whatever the thing might be.
For sure. So, you know, experimentation is of critical importance, but I would say we probably don't see it happening enough or as well as it should. I think, especially when it comes to programmatic, because there is a lot of AI built into it, whether that's auto bidding, different targeting options, measurement options, it's very easy to turn it on and say, okay, well, I'll set it and forget it and the machine will do it. But there are, you know, the technology is evolving so rapidly. There's always new features. There's always new options, and they're going to work better for certain advertisers or certain objectives or certain formats. And figuring out what's right for your brand is an ongoing, you know, there's no end point. It is an ongoing thing that you need to be doing. So, you know, one example, and we've talked, you know, we maybe made fun of last click attribution a little bit. We see a lot of advertisers starting to work more on testing out custom bidding solutions. So instead of, you know, everybody going to the same CPA or even to a ROAS, it's can we customize what that the value is of a conversion? So, you know, linking it into, you know, maybe some of their own first party data to say, well, this conversion is worth X dollars. That conversion is worth a different amount, and start to bid and optimize to some more advanced metrics like that. And I think that's a really great area where people are leaning in. We are able to bring extra support and resources to help clients do that, to make sure they're understanding the tools. But again, you know, when I said, you know, it's not happening enough, but it's also not happening well enough. I think that well enough piece is, there is a lot of experimentation kind of for experimentation's sake sometimes. And I think sometimes it gets a bit disjointed from the business objective. And yes, there's this cool new feature, so let's test it. But without thinking through how that's actually going to drive your business outcomes, you will finish your test and say, oh, well, that was interesting, but you won't know what to actually do differently. Yeah. I think having a well-run test will have a hypothesis. It will have a success metric and say, if we achieve X, if we hit this milestone, or if this works this well, this is what we are going to do going forward because of that, and actually change your behavior. And I think that's where it needs to come in more is, you know, testing or experimentation are fine, but really the purpose of them is to learn and improve. And if you're not taking those learnings and improving your outcomes, then it's kind of pointless. And so what I'd love to see is for it to happen more, but for it to happen better and connected to those business objectives, whether that is custom bidding right in the platform or things that use third-party options outside of Google, just connecting it in a more effective way, I think is where we need to go.
Is there
totally makes sense.
in your experience, is there what percentage of budget makes sense to add towards testing to make it meaningful?
I've seen different advertisers that do have kind of a rule of thumb, and they'll say, you know, we always set aside a testing budget of 5 or 10. I think the highest I've seen is 20%. Again, I know it's a lot.
Wow.
Again, there's no right answer, though. The purpose of testing is to learn and change to improve. And sometimes that will take 2% of your budget. Sometimes that might take 10% of your budget. And if the learning outcome is worthwhile, you should spend the money on that test. And if the learning outcome is not, then it's again, coming back to business objectives. And there is no, in my opinion, there's no clear rule of thumb.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we're right here getting close to the end. And I think we really want to wrap up our conversation around the idea of like, what are those predictions that we're seeing, that you're seeing around the future of programmatic advertising in Canada? And what factors do you believe that it will actually drive the evolution? And I think, Jeremy, maybe you can kick off there with us.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think continued growth in programmatic is really being driven by a couple things, and most of which we've talked about today. Privacy is going to continue to evolve the industry, both through new tactics that get developed in terms of audience targeting and in terms of measurement, and really just evolving technologies that have maybe been there for a very long time and past their expiration date. Right. So I think we're going to see new gas, new forms of fuel powering kind of that programmatic engine going forward. Second would be, kind of newer formats like CTV, like digital out of home, like digital audio. I think that that's a real explosion right now that we're kind of seeing, and I think that that's going to continue for sure. And then the other one, which is I think another big topic today, was AI. I think that we're going to continue to see evolved ways of incorporating AI within media buying tools like DSPs, and I think that that's going to really push things forward into new and exciting places as well. And I think the biggest shifts that the industry has to kind of undertake to really capture the opportunity here is in some ways changing the way that we've operated. We need to start breaking down more silos between different media teams within organizations, because more and more inventory that used to be siloed is now addressable through programmatic. And that's going to take a big change in all of our mindsets and in some cases all of our skills to accommodate this. And we're really starting to see that happen in a big way across different companies that we work with. And we're super excited about it, and we expect it to continue.
As amazing as the tech evolution is, the biggest future question mark is around the people again.
Yeah. Ooh, look at Ben. You've done
see
this
how
before,
we wrapped it all in a nice little bow to finish it off.
That was nice. That was nice. Put a little bow on it.
I love it.
Practicing that in front of a mirror the whole week.
Guys, this has been a fantastic conversation. How can people find out more about you and the work you're doing?
Jared's going to laugh at me because he likes to make fun. But for me, the best one is on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. Search and add me. Happy to connect with anyone who wants to chat about programmatic or the future of digital ads.
I'm less active on LinkedIn because nobody could be as active as Ben. But I too am more than willing to connect with new folks and have conversations about programmatic. Really looking forward to seeing the response. This was a lot of fun.
This was a really good
So that's why you haven't accepted my invitation yet, Jeremy. Okay.
If you need to talk to Jared, people tend to go through me.
Is that really there? Is there really a pending invitation?
No, there isn't. I'm just playing. There will be after the call.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you both. It was a lot of fun.
Today.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys. This is awesome.
And now the post pod with V and Marc. On script.
Programmatic.
Hey,
Post pod.
it is the post pod.
It is a post pod.
Here we go, V.
Here we go.
So
Welcome back.
September. Here we go. Yeah, and we're in September. This is fantastic.
We're rejuvenated,
Excited, enthusiastic.
all of it.
All those things. It's amazing.
That's great.
That was a cool conversation. I mean, to be totally fair, you're way more advanced on the programmatic side than I am. I have I would say like a very peripheral couple of use cases of running programmatic, not the extent of like that you've had of trying to bring it in house. So maybe like kind of just take me through like an overview of what you thought of the conversation and some of the highlights you had.
You know, I'm honest, like I wish we had more time with them because, you know, for me, the programmatic space has evolved so much I know we kept using the reference like the last 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
but really it's even in the last 5 years where we've seen leaps and bounds of new ways of targeting audiences. Obviously like the big push where, your people are opting out of their ads on their iPhones, the privacy regulations has really shifted and forced these platforms to find better, more efficient ways of targeting at the end of the day. And I think what's interesting, and they highlighted this in their conversation, is we as a user group, and not as an advertiser, but as consumers, we dictate the evolution of the platforms. And I think what's interesting now, it's because it's become so, I guess, top of mind for a lot of consumers, like, hey, how am I being tracked? Am I opting into sharing my cookies? Am I not opting into the sharing of the cookies? It's forcing the Googles of the world to really rethink what their strategies are and the underlying tech that provides then advertisers that closer ability to find that personalization journey. Because let's not forget, when surveyed, and we can either people will say one thing but do another.
Sure.
When surveyed, people always say that they want more personalized ads.
Yeah.
And that's where it's almost like, okay, how are we going to continue to navigate the space? And the nuance, because we live in Canada, there is some element of it that we just don't have the full breadth available to us yet, like say in the United States or even in Europe, but they're even more governed in Europe than we are here. So I really enjoyed the conversation, and we probably could have taken it in a lot of different directions as well. But I love the 4 buckets that Jeremy highlighted around the prospecting, contextual. I love the whole notion that we've come full circle on contextual. Audience targeting and the private marketplaces is a good way to kind of think about, like, those are the opportunities you have when you leverage.
Yeah. The contextual part was interesting because, and you probably have been in this situation before. Somebody in an executive position goes, well, I just want to buy like that spot on Vanity Fair's website, because it's like they think about it like advertising in a magazine. And then fast forward and then to say 10 years ago, it was, no, we can reach people wherever they are. And then it doesn't have to be on a particular magazine, on a website from Vanity Fair's magazine. It could be like vanityfair.com. It could be any website, and people are multitudes. They don't just consume like I like wine art. I already did when I was 18 or whatever, 17. So I might have visited that website at the time, Vanity Fair. I'm really painting a picture for myself, Vanity Fair. But then I might have also been like Powder Magazine and like Fantasy Football. You know what I mean? Like, I'm all those people. Is weird
Guys all over the place.
It's totally. But I think most people are like that. There's very few people that only consume one form of content, and so then you're looking for contextual targeting. I think that it's kind of come full circle where now you can go back to that and select only the placements that really matter to you.
Yeah, I agree with you. The contextual side is really interesting, and I think it's, again, and I love that it has become, I kind of like the fact that it's come full circle, if I'm being honest, because I think you and I can also, attest, like, how much personalization is too much? How far do you have to go? Do you really need to go to find like that one-to-one message with the consumer? Or is it just like looking at those broader audiences where you kind of target? And that's where contextual works great, because it's like almost like the broadest audience you can find. So it's like, they use basketball as an example. I think it's a great one, but we have a shoe. We want to target people that want basketball information. That's very simple. It's these sports sites, it's these, retailers or whatever. And it's your largest possible audience. That's okay. There's a lot you can do even with that in of itself.
Totally.
So, and I think more than anything, just challenging and thinking about, like, how do you perceive your audience through these digital platforms? Now, the one thing I did want to touch on is a little bit, and it's actually really, really resonated with me right now. Prior to this conversation, I never thought of YouTube as CTV. And that's a mistake on my half, because I probably consume more YouTube through my television than I do on my phone or my computer.
Yeah.
And the targeting opportunities that exist on YouTube are insane.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, you layer in search keywords into your YouTube targeting. I remember, funny, I don't remember. A long time ago, I was running a brand campaign. I'm trying to remember where it was. But anyway, it was a brand campaign, and we had YouTube ads. It was probably when we were working together at Sport Check. And it was the first time I remember seeing TV show up as a placement. And it was like, at the time, like, I think it was when we were at Sport Check. Anyway, it was like in January I ran the campaign, and it was 3%. It showed up as a new metric, 3% placements on TV. I didn't target it because I didn't even know it existed. Mm-hmm. Fast forward to the spring, and there was another video of same kind of concept that we were trying to get out there. And I didn't target it because, I couldn't select that. And it was suddenly like 15% of the consumption came from a TV screen. I was like, that's cool. Mm-hmm. Like either the demand of
crazy
went up that much over a period of time. And this is like 6 years ago, before all these smart TVs really made a dent. It was fascinating to me. I remember thinking it was super interesting. And then when I was working at an agency later on, we would select TV placements exclusively from YouTube because we could get sound on environments, and most often people would consume video longer on a TV set than they would on a mobile device. So you're getting extra attention, extra reach, extra impressions for the brand and all that kind of stuff. And so it was really fascinating. So I kind of only accidentally thought of YouTube as like a connected thing, only because I just happened to see this weird metric show up at one point. But even now, there's so much more inventory than there ever was before, because you've got all these new channels. And I don't know where Netflix ad platform, maybe that's not through programmatic, but that's a thing. Hulu's a thing. Roku's a thing. Like, so many of these platforms now have connected TV. It's fascinating.
You brought up a great example when you used, I don't remember what Shaw calls it, but I use Apple TV, and sometimes it'll just show me, hey, there's the game on, or like the Flames are down 2-0 to Edmonton, or up, or whatever. And you can just quickly switch to the game. Now, cool. It's not Apple that's giving you the feed. It's connected to my TV provider that I've hooked up in the back end, and it's bringing the game up. Or, for example, if I'm searching for a movie, and it's like, well, the movie's on Prime, or it's over here on the Apple platform, and then you can pick and choose where you go. And I think when you said that, and it's like, it doesn't matter where the source is coming from anymore. All that matters is that you're getting to the content. Mm-hmm. So when we're thinking about now in the context of ads, where you're consuming that ad, you may not, like you said, you didn't even know it was on YouTube. Mm-hmm. When you were watching the show, or a clip, but all of a sudden an ad pops up, right? Yep. So it's interesting to kind of perceive TV as TV, and not really through the lens of what is traditional, what is connected, and whatnot. It's like, no, this is the screen. Mm-hmm. So if someone's watching it on YouTube, this is what it looks like. If someone's watching it on their mobile phone, this is what it looks like. But people are also consuming, say, Rogers Sportsnet on their phones too. Yeah. So it's like, you're almost playing to the screens versus the platforms. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I thought, the comment, I think it was Ben that mentioned it about like making it easier for buyers to buy. Like, there are so many places to put an ad. It would be almost impossible. Like, if you rewind to the beginning of my career, like literally there was TV, radio, a little tiny bit of website, and then print. And out of home, but that was it. Like, you pretty much had 4 places you could put an ad up. Now there's hundreds of, maybe thousands of places you could put an ad up. And so there's this also challenge in terms of like a fracturing of the share of market from a media perspective, like of broadcasters. Like, you have many more places to put my attention. And broadcasters go, like even our podcast as an example.
Oh my goodness.
So like finding the places, and buying that is becoming so much more challenging. And so I think programmatic solves a buyer's need and a brand's need to get in front of a lot of people at once in sophisticated ways that are helpful.
No, I'm with you. And I think, if we kind of like go full circle here in the sense, like, I'm excited about the programmatic space specifically, and where it's headed. More so because, if I use it through the lens of an advertiser, I'm extremely excited because I think the tools are going to continuously evolve. It's going to help us, drive more efficiency with our media spend, maximize our media facing dollars, or you're able then to really maybe quantify something's working or it's not working. So I'm excited about all those aspects because I think it just gives us more access and more tools to continuously try to be better at what we do, or a product that we sell, or service that we sell. And when I think about it in a consumer perspective, there is a point where I want to make sure that the information that I provide, and I think there's going to be a shift where we'll be very linear in what information is accessible, say, to advertisers. And when that happens, then I will probably be even more forthcoming to specific ads because I know what to expect. I still believe, like, from a consumer perspective, like right now, I don't know, like on Instagram as an example, I'm getting targeted by this ad probably like 8 times a day. And even though I'm saying, hey, I don't want to see this anymore because the frequency is too high, it's turned into annoyance for me. Sure. And just imagine that at scale, especially when we were doing these larger campaigns. So that's where I think, frequency capping models, the ability to target more nuanced audiences, that's where it becomes important. And that's where programmatic can kind of help and drive the volume to all the channels through one consolidated platform.
Let me ask you this, because you were involved in trying to bring programmatic in-house, or did. And so we talked about a little bit about risk to the brand, either placements or fraud or something like that. How big of an obstacle was that, or big of a concern was that for the executive teams that you were working with? And then what kinds of things did you try to put in place to mitigate for that?
Yeah, no, that was huge. And it's a great question, Mark. It was huge because the last thing man, have you done this before? It's definitely top of mind, especially even our shared experience at SportCheck, where we kind of started venturing down that path. Executives wanted to know that, they were safeguarded and that we wouldn't be showing up in websites that were, controversial in any way, shape, or form. And I think at the time, and that's how, in full transparency here to our audience, it's how I met Ben. We worked hand in hand at the time with Google, just to kind of bring to life what a I guess an internalized solution could look like for at the time at SportCheck. And they had, this is a few years ago, and I'm sure like it's evolved even more since then. But they had essentially algorithms and that would kind of run to find a lot of these websites that were, again, I'm just going to use the word controversial, that would automatically put them in this bucket that didn't make that inventory accessible to the platforms. And I think for me, because again, that was one of my first ventures into that space. Then subsequently, when I did it a second time, I remember at the time it was, how did not only we would provide, kind of direction in terms of like what sites were off brand, bounds.
Yeah,
exactly. Because sometimes it's like the brands change. So the product that you're featuring, but then it's working through an SI as well to kind of really identify that and showcase that, it's safeguarded. Here's a pool, and they would send a report. I remember it was it every second month? I think it's like new sites were added to this like blackout list. So that was like the transparency that you wanted to know that, hey, this is top of mind for them. They're making sure that your inventory is not going to places where it could be conspicuous or put you in a bad light. Because it is hard. Because Ben talked about the set it and forget it. I know a lot of digital marketers that will go in. Here's the ad. here's the creative, here's my targeting, this is what I want, this is much money I'm putting in, run it, and just walk away. While that works, it can work, you do have to be diligent on your own as well and make sure you're asking for those reports. Where did these impressions come to life? And even if you're spot checking it as well, saying, okay, let's just take some of these URLs. Do they check out? Do they not check out? Yeah. There's still a lot of fraud out there, and that's still a reality, though.
Did you ever have to deal with like bot fraud, like as far as, or is that the bad websites that you're talking about?
So I didn't have to deal with bot fraud. There was an instance of it, but it was like a third-party vendor. I don't care to talk about them publicly, but we realized that the impressions that they were showcasing to us were coming from bots, and I never personally had a problem ever running through, Google's platforms for that matter. And I think that's, again, where it's like, you got to also have to be careful on who you're partnering with. You want to work with those that probably have the most experience in the space more than anything.
Yeah. And arguably Google does.
I would think they would.
Yeah, they're up there. They've served a few ads.
A few.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. The other one that I thought was really interesting, I think it was Jared talking about originally the measurement and attribution, and just in terms of like having a conversation with the executive team and talking about what success looks like upfront before even like day one, turning the power on a computer.
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting. And then figuring out what the metrics are that you're going to use to evaluate success by. And then later on, when we were talking to Ben about the experimentation, how often that should link back to one another. Like the experiment shouldn't be an experiment for the experiment's sake. It should be, how are we improving the outcomes that we said that we were going to measure against? And so, yeah, I thought that was really cool just to see. I mean, it's not radical in any way. It's just very logical, but it's good to hear that perspective, I thought.
I agree with you. If we just touch on the experimentation side, I think Ben said something to the effect of, the budget can be anything that you need it to be, as long as it's answering the question that you had.
Yeah.
Right. And I think how much do you value, say, that problem statement that you've set out for that test? That should be how you determine, I guess, your budget. So I never thought about it like that. Obviously, for me, it's always been something, hey, we're going to set aside 10% of our budget and we're going to just test. But maybe we're doing a lift study and it requires a larger investment. We should be able to invest that because that's going to inform future business decisions. So I think there's an important distinction there. And then coming back to your point on measurement, my goodness. It's still, I think, today, the biggest challenge that organizations have is alignment on how to effectively measure their marketing spend or how they're driving value. I think it was in a conversation we just had, I think in the previous podcast, just around like, how do you think about brand in the context of marketing? It's like generating future cash flow. When you put it in that lens, it's less about brand building to the business. It's more about reassuring, like, this is what we're driving. So if you take that as an example, then start thinking about, okay, what is going to be that attribution model or our measurement framework to help drive that? That's a conversation you need to have with your executives and set an alignment and say, hey, here we're using last click attribution because it's Black Friday, Cyber Monday, but for everything else, we're doing this.
Yeah.
And that's how we're going to help answer that question for you, driving that future cash flow.
Yeah.
Or insert thing here.
Yeah, totally. The other one, I think, I'm pretty sure it was Jeremy that said this, but just identifying what the holes are. Like, where do you have a blind spot in your metric? And so being aware of that, I think, is a really great idea. Because you believe that you can measure all kinds of things, but you might not take as much time to be aware of the things that you can't measure or the limitations of your measurement. And so I think that was really important too. Like even things like, I know we talked about it today, but ROAS, and we've had conversations about ROAS before, but like, it sounds obvious, but like, what does ROAS actually mean? And you know what I mean? And like, from a perspective of what are our holes, like what is it not measuring and what is it measuring? And so I think that like the definition and clearly outlining where there's blind spots in a single metric like that, even though if you have a metric, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a great view of what it means.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a nice departure, I guess, from a conversations that we usually have. And it got a little bit more tactical, if you will, but I think I'm just naturally just very, very interested in this space because it's changing so much. And selfishly, I just want to continue to learn and pressure test.
No, but I mean, it's a great conversation to have for a whole bunch of reasons. But I mean, if you take strategy as a framework and use Roger Martin's like 5 steps, right? Like this fits solely into like your core capabilities and management systems, right? Like what kind of tools are you using to support your company's objectives?
Great point.
And so you can go down a path of, and to your point, like maybe I'll talk about owning contracts because I wanted to ask you about that and I didn't want to interrupt the conversation. But even as a starting point of when you said to own a contract, it doesn't mean you have to bring in the DSP and, take over the agency's objective of managing media through programmatic. But maybe just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the biggest trend right now that not only that I've seen, obviously, Ben and Jeremy talked about it as well, is kind of leaning into the idea of owning your own data. So this has become a biggest reasons because the consumers are expecting more of, your as an advertiser, how are you using this information, right? So because that never lived with advertisers originally, that lived through agencies. So agencies would kind of create a seat for you. Mm-hmm. The seat then would be your data. So they would always say, hey, if you ever needed it, we'd export it for you, et cetera. But you never owned it. It was owned by the agency. Now what they're doing, so Google works with other like media players like MediaMonks. I think even Deloitte has an instance where essentially you can buy seats, your own seats through these integrators that allows you to then to have your own name essentially on them. So at any point, you're the sole owner of these data points and you don't seek the extrapolation of it from any other third party. You just can't buy it directly through Google right now. They have, these, it's not an SI. They're not integrating that. Forget what the acronym is right now, but you buy it through them, but it is your own seat. And that again gives the ownership back to the advertiser, where then it's like looking at their entire data pool to say, okay, this is all the information we have on the potential user. Obviously it's non.
So this is like when you're saying your own seat, it's own seat on a trade desk.
Essentially, yeah. So like there's search, there's obviously like the programmatic space that you can do display. It's just owning that technology and owning it outright. So like GA360. So there's like the search instance itself. If you just want contract to that, so the Sleeping Barber podcast buys this and it's essentially the owner of that. That's essentially what the contract is. Now you can do the whole suite or you can do the individual products as well.
Cool.
Which it gives autonomy back to the advertiser and the responsibility at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And it's usually the first step, the first toe that dips into the ocean before you start, okay, well, how do we look at, potentially internalizing this? Mm-hmm. And then you see a lot of organizations like, hey, maybe it's a channel we internalize first. Usually it's search that comes in first internally because it's usually one of the higher spends in budget. So it's like, hey, how do we control that? But I just wanted to end with the notion that resourcing, if you are ever thinking about like internalizing, a digital marketing stack like this, resourcing is a big thing. And we seldom are able to build the same feeder systems that agencies can. So you have to make sure that not only your executive leadership team is on board with doing so, because it's a long-term investment. It's not just like, we're going to do it in 1 year. It doesn't happen in 1 year. But after year one, say you own contracts year one, year two, you bring in 1 or 2 channels. Great. Who's staffed against that? Yeah. But it's building towards that. Make sure you have people behind because it's such a small space in Canada. all it takes is someone throwing your star pupil $30,000 more and they're gone.
Yeah.
Like
And then the investment you just put into it all is gone.
Exactly.
Fascinating. It's a cool conversation.
It's
It's a really interesting topic for sure.
Yeah, man. No, I'm happy that, Ben and Jeremy both could come on.
Yeah.
And it was a great comment.
Yeah.
Great conversation.
Totally. All right, V. Well, that was great. Yeah, let's do it again.
Do it again.
I got a feeling we're probably going to do it again. Before you go, we'd love a review. If you've got a chance to take a minute or two and leave us a review, give us some feedback, we'd love to hear from you. We really want to make this show better, and your feedback will help us do that. Thank you.